1, 2, 3.
While our weekly shows are edited to time for broadcast on public TV and community radio, we offer to our members and podcast subscribers the full uncut conversation. The following is from our episode, Patrick and Claud Cockburn, A Legacy of Guerrilla Journalism Against Media Complacency. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters.
Dishonest reporting on war, racism, and politicians' lies, normalizing coverage of fascists campaigning for high office. If you are seeing too much of that sort of thing right now, know that you're not alone. And it's not the first time we've seen a situation like the one we're in today. Go back 90 years, for example, and you will find a prequel in the period that saw the rise of Adolf Hitler. What was the headline over the New York Times report on Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany on January 31st, 1933? Well, here's what it was. Hitler puts aside aim to be dictator. And they continue, there is no warrant for immediate alarm. The more violent parts of Hitler's alleged program, he has himself in recent months been softening down or abandoning. Hitler, of course, went on to invade Poland, spark World War II, and implemented genocide, slaughtering 6 million Jews and millions of others, including disabled people, LGBT people, communists, and ethnic minorities. Today, we are going to learn about a young British journalist who, seeing what was happening at that time, quit his job with the prestigious London Times and founded The Week, an independent newsletter that became famous for its scoops and opposition to fascism and to the Western powers that were enabling its rise. His name was Claud Cockburn, and he's the topic of a new biography by his son, Patrick Cockburn, that's titled Believe Nothing Until It Is Officially Denied, Claud Cockburn and the Invention of Guerrilla Journalism. It's just out from Verso. Patrick is an award-winning journalist himself, with a long expertise, especially in the Middle East. And if all that wasn't reason enough to focus here today, there's also the fact that Claud was my grandfather, making Patrick my uncle. Now, regular viewers of this program have already met my sister, my partner, and learned about my dad, so let's round out the family tree a little bit further. Welcome to the program, Patrick. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
I should say that you have brothers. You weren't the only son of Claud Cockburn.
There are 3 brothers. There's my much-loved eldest brother, Alexander, who died about a dozen years ago. There's my other brother, Andrew, who is works for as the Washington editor of Harper's, produced many books, many on military themes, dissenting wholly from conventional wisdom in a very convincing way. So we all became journalists. I mean, Claude's 3 sons. And we've all I don't think we've sat down and thought we'll do the same as our father did, but we have sort of opposed the powers that be in our different ways, and hopefully with some effect.
And for people that are keeping track at home, you had 2 half-sisters, and it was one of those half-sisters who was my mother.
Exactly, yes.
Let's talk about why this book now. Why did you decide that Claude, who had written several volumes of his own autobiography, deserved another look by you?
Well, obviously I knew about him when I was growing up, and I knew what he'd done. He'd written an excellent autobiography in 3 volumes. And I think what tipped the balance in my mind towards writing a biography about him was in 2003, I asked MI5, the British equivalent of the FBI, if I could see his archive, what they had on him, which I knew they might release because 50 years had passed. I mean, enough time had passed for them to do so. I heard nothing, and then they released them 24 volumes or large files to the National Archives in Kew in London. And then I found that 2 things. one, there was an awful lot in them that I didn't know. Secondly, I'd often wondered if Claude's newsletter, The Week, all his campaigning against the Nazis and the government at the time, had had much impact on the powers that be. And I could see from the MI5 files that it had enormous influence, that you found all these senior civil servants saying, how did he find this out? He seems to know about what was happening in a cabinet meeting a few days before. Can't we do something about this guy? Loads of stuff. And I think that's what determined me to do it. And ever since, I've been sort of collecting information and finding lots of things that I didn't know about him.
Well, I learned things I didn't know about him from the book, so I appreciate that. Just because some of those MI files are so delicious in their ridiculous detail, is there any bit you want to share?
Well, there were loads of things, soon after he started it, they wondered how on earth he knew what the Prime Minister had been saying to the ministers about a possible British military agreement with Germany. Hitler had just taken power. And the first sort of year of the week is very impressive. At a time when the New York Times and others were saying that Hitler's bark would be worse than his bite. Claude had, horrible but graphic accounts of the persecution and murder of Jews in Germany. I mean, he had no doubt that this Hitler and the Nazis were the ultimate evil. Long before any of the newspapers and the politicians realized the same in the US and UK. So I think that's the most impressive thing about it.
He had that because he had spent time in Germany himself. He'd been in pre-war Berlin. Talk a little bit about his history and how you think he came to be so clear-sighted as to what was going on, to see it so clearly.
Well, his father was a British diplomat, so at quite an impressionable age, I think it was about 16, he went to join his father in Budapest. Budapest the First World War had officially ended, but in a sense it was still going on in Budapest. There were pogroms going on. There was Red Terror. There was White Terror. There was eventually a very nasty dictatorship. So he was very plugged into the politics of Central Europe. He learnt German. He went to Berlin. He worked for the London Times. He spoke perfect German. He then later returned. He went to the US just before the Great Crash. He covered that. Then in 1932, through German friends, he knew things that were getting worse and worse in Berlin. So he resigned from the Times. He was New York correspondent, one of the New York correspondents, and returned first to Vienna and then to Germany, and found things that, bad though he thought they'd be, they were even worse. Because these were the last days of the Weimar Republic. These were the, Nazi stormtroopers were already in the streets. And then about 48 hours before Hitler took power, Claude was told by friends, it'd be a really good idea to get out, that they got your name on a list. And he thought for a moment, maybe I'll stay, I've got a British passport. And then common sense reasserted itself and he got on the train to Vienna. So he just got out. Then he thought, got there. He had no money. He didn't have a job, but he thought, what can I do to oppose this ultimate evil? So he had very precise ideas how this would be done. So he set up this newsletter, The Week, in London in an attic. And he filled it. It was filled with scoops from the beginning. His idea was to influence the influencers. He knew it wouldn't get to that number of people, but he hoped it could get to people who were really interested in what was going on. It would get to journalists, it would get to politicians and so forth. But that sort of idea only works if you can really provide the goods in terms of information that other people don't have, which he did, which is the real reason why it took off and became influential.
There's a part in his memoir that you quote in your book where he's describing what people are actually saying in the capitals of Europe and how refugees from Germany are quite clear about what's happening and speaking in panicked, or if not panicked, at least super concerned terms. He then points out that the language, what is being said and the way that it's being said is simply not appearing in the newspapers of the day. Can you talk about the significance of that and the parallels, if you see them, to this moment?
Yes, there was a great sort of vacuum of information about what a lot of people knew what was happening and what was appearing in the media. Now, this doesn't really, I think, really come across in history books because newspapers in general, I mean, invariably, in fact, don't want to admit to their own failings, and in terms of Hitler or any other big historic event, be it the invasion of Iraq, be it what's happening at the moment in Gaza and Lebanon. But so I think this became somewhat obscured later. But he felt that it was very discouraging that this wasn't in the newspapers. But he also thought it's very encouraging in a way because he could fill that vacuum. So he sort of felt that, I mean, he said at one point that even if he made only a small noise in the sort of atmosphere of the 1930s, in the atmosphere of continual crises, this would sound like a scream. And in many ways, it did. So his calculation worked out. He felt it was something that would work when you had an era of continual crisis, or a series of crises as you had in the 1930s. And that was again a reason for writing the book now, because it seems to me the 2020s are rather like the 1930s, that we have one crisis succeeding another. We have these crises turning into wars. The 1930s became known as the Devil's Decade. In a way, I think one could use the same words to describe the 2020s. So I think it's sort of particularly opposite what he was trying to do then with what's happening now.
One moment that summarizes to me, or at least sort of sums up a lot of the parallels, is the moment where the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, takes to the pulpit, as it were, the podium, to declare that he has a relationship with Adolf Hitler. They've met, and that there is not war but peace in the offing. This is 1938. Here's a snippet of that speech.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
That was Neville Chamberlain speaking in 1938 in the famous Peace in Our Time speech. Forgive me if I'm exaggerating, but I hear in that a version of what we have been hearing all year from the U.S. President, Joe Biden, in relation to Israel and Gaza. A ceasefire is in the works. Just a little bit longer. We're working ceaselessly. Kamala Harris says the same thing. Am I being hyperbolic here?
No, unfortunately not, I think. It's sort of, and I think that was Claude's great frustration, as one might feel frustrated now, that it was pretty obvious what was going on. It was pretty obvious that things were going to get worse. Yet those who were meant to be in charge kept on announcing that, peace was just around the corner, that things weren't as bad as they looked. So, yeah, I think that the parallel is all too strong. And so every time, practically by the day in the 1930s, these crises got worse. And the same thing seems to be happening today.
Why do you think, as somebody who's written for mainline publications like The Independent and others, Patrick, why do you think mainstream media is so bad at sounding an alarm? Are they invested in there not being war, us not naming fascism? Are they simply scared, intimidated from saying the things they really know to be true? Is it this kind of illusion of objectivity that if we actually sound anything other than normal, will be considered biased? What is it? What holds journalists and their publications back?
Well, a lot of them sort of basically reflect the attitude of the government of the country they're in. They will reflect the attitude of the proprietor. In the US, I guess the Biden administration benefits from the fact that so much of the media doesn't, for a long time, hasn't wanted anything to say too much negative about Biden and his Middle East policy on the grounds that it will benefit Donald Trump in the election. I think that retrospectively, certainly the press often have amnesia about this. I mean, at the time that Neville Chamberlain was speaking in 1938, it was pretty well known none of the established press wanted to disagreeing with him, and there was one newspaper, I think it was called the News Chronicle, where the editor had an opinion poll. It was an early opinion poll done, but basically the same idea as today. And it's often said that the politicians and the newspaper are only following public opinion, but actually that's not true. The opinion poll showed that the great majority of the British public completely distrusted Hitler, didn't believe his word over Munich, thought there should be more defense spending, and so forth. So what did the editor do with it? He took it to 10 Downing Street to show to Chamberlain. So he refused to publish it in his newspaper. So a lot of the sort of things that happened then, I'm afraid, happen now. What can one do about it? Well, Claude felt one simple thing, and this is reflected in the title of the book, which is skepticism for individual, whether you read a newspaper, watching television, or any other part of the news outlets, just to be skeptical, not to believe anything, and it's officially denied. It's amazing how many people, including lots of journalists, don't focus on the fact that so much of what they're being told is partisan, that those who leak them things have very good reasons for doing so. And, you find this not just in the present war, but as I've been sort of war correspondent in the Middle East, and have covered wars elsewhere. And it sort of amazes me rather in retrospect how very crucial things were misreported by the press. I remember in 2001 in Afghanistan, it was fairly obvious, if one was reporting day to day, that the Taliban hadn't been defeated, they'd gone home. But the media sort of reported that they were out of business, no need to pay any attention to those guys anymore. Well, look what happened since. In 2003, the Iraqi army completely defeated, mission accomplished. We can put our own guys in to rule in Baghdad. Completely untrue. Most of the Iraqi army had gone home. There was no way the Iraqis going to accept an occupation. And the revelations often, that what's really happening often don't come from the mass media. They come from politicians or they come from elsewhere.
Well, being on the ground, I mean, you were on the ground in the same way that Claude has been on the ground. I always feel like we get information that seems obvious when we're in a place and then come back to try to report it, and it's sort of untellable truth. I want to come back to the Middle East in a second, but before we do, one of the aspects of the book that is so helpful to me and gratifying in a sense is that you add lots of people back into the story that didn't get much of a due in a lot of Claude's autobiographical writings, and paint a picture of Claude in that work, but a lot of other people with him. My grandmother is mentioned, Hope Hale Davis, Jean Ross. Do you want to talk a bit, Gerda Toro? You want to talk a little bit about some of the characters in Claude's life that fill out the picture? Because I found it striking. The community, the company that he was in at that time.
Sure. I mean, at quite an early stage, when he was at university, when he was at Oxford, his sort of closest pal was Graham Greene, the novelist, and there was a cousin, Evelyn Waugh, another novelist. These were very sort of close friends of his. They don't get much of a mention in his autobiography, but rather amazingly, his first two wives don't get mentioned at all. The first, Hope Hale, who was a journalist in New York, whom he married in 1931, and had a daughter by, and she thought of writing about him and their relationship, and also about his second wife, Jean Ross, who was the model for Christopher Isherwood's Sally Bowles, in Cabaret and elsewhere, but originally in Isherwood's novella about Sally Bowles in Berlin, who Hope, rather amazingly, became a very best friend of. And I found that extraordinarily interesting, because I knew absolutely nothing or very little about this. Also, Claude was sort of writing back. He had told her that he was going to resign from the Times and go back to Central Europe, to Berlin, and because things were getting so bad. And she said, well, she wanted to have a baby, and she also wanted to get married, which they did. But he told her previously he was going back. He did go back. And their relationship lasted for some time, but eventually they had a divorce, although it was a rather crude divorce that I think was called a Mexican divorce at that time. You simply wrote to a lawyer in Mexico, including $100, and he sent you back a piece of paper saying you were divorced, and you sent him another $100. This was rather created a number of problems for Claude, because although that might be recognized by an American court, it wouldn't be recognized by a British court. So although he lived with Jean Ross and she changed her name to Jean Cockburn, he was never officially married to her. Same with my mother, Patricia, a baroness she'd been. And again, they did eventually get married, but initially she changed her name to Patricia Cockburn. But I found all that, the information, the letters, everything else that Hope had collected at that time of sort of riveting interest.
I mean, it's kind of extraordinary that he left Jean and Hope out of his other autobiographies. Any insight into why?
Maybe just sort of too complicated.
A little complication that helped
complicated.
bring me to being. I take it seriously. I
Sure.
take umbrage. So
You take umbrage?
Well, I was very.
I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, there's quite a lot of sort of surprising things sort of left out of the book. Not just that, but when he was at school, there was a great sort of riot at the end of the First World War. There's practically no mention of that. There was no mention of going even earlier. He said his father had sort of retired from the Foreign Office and returned from South Korea, where he'd been the chief British diplomat. Actually, I discovered that by going to the Foreign Office archives, that there were sort of an enormous sort of heaps of documents surrounding why his father, Henry Cockburn, had resigned from the Foreign Office, which were very estimable, that he was asked to take part in the rendition of a Korean who'd fled to British-controlled territory to escape the Japanese occupation, and he wouldn't return him over because he said he'd get tortured. And they actually used the word rendition on the official papers. I thought it was a sort of new thing that only happened after 9/11 and so forth. So he wouldn't turn him over to because he thought he'd be tortured. Eventually, the Foreign Office forced him to, and he immediately resigned from the Foreign Office. So a rather sort of dramatic tale. Again, no mention of this.
Well, don't get me wrong. I adored Claude and admired him tremendously, a huge hero in my life. But have to say, I was glad to see that you both found writings by my grandmother that hadn't been published and that they helped to add so much to the story. Coming back...
Yeah, she was very, she was highly intelligent. And she wrote very lucidly and very perceptively about him. And I like to sort of take her stuff, where she sort of, to a substantial degree, worked out what made him tick. Certainly sort of emotionally, not while the other source about him is completely different, which is MI5 and these intelligence operatives and, agents going to see him in the office and pretending to be journalists and so forth, and all these policemen and others talking about him. So that's a completely different angle you get. So I like to sort of compare the two angles that you got from Hope and to a degree from Jean Ross with what the security services thought.
I'm always interested. I'm often asked, where do I get my political sort of framing from? Where does my ideology or my view of the world come from? It's not such an easy question to answer. Did you get any clearer as to what had influenced Claude? What caused him to have the politics that he had? And do you want to describe that just a little bit?
I think from an early stage, I sort of discovered this while writing the book. He was pretty sort of rebellious from an early stage. He started up, even as a 15-year-old at school, two sort of different newspapers, handwritten, which are very sort of critical of the school authorities, and both of which were banned. Although he got on quite well with the headmaster. I think it may have come from his father, who was very much very conservative, we would say a high Tory, but at the same time very sort of skeptical about the powers that be. But then I think a critical thing was to be in Hungary, in Central Europe, just after the First World War. The First World War made many sort of intellectuals and others feel that the authorities, the governments, had discredited themselves. But he was in Budapest. Things were sort of particularly bad. This was a land of massacres and very recent massacres. And initially, he was sympathetic to Germany. That sympathy ebbed as the years went by. By the 30s, he sort of started with a skepticism towards German nationalism and a hatred of fascism, not just Hitler, but Mussolini, from a very early stage. Was he sort of known about these guys for a decade before others? And when the Week had a scoop that about the Spanish Civil War was going to start, was writing about that a month or two before there was the attempted putsch, the military uprising by Franco against the democratically elected government, and he went sort of immediately to fight for them. He became a communist, joined the Communist Party after getting back from Germany, because he thought they were the only people who had the sort of fanaticism and the organization to fight Hitler. He also thought that in Spain that only through sort of organization, their sort of organization and arms from the Soviet Union did they stand the slightest chance of winning. they weren't just fighting Franco. They were fighting. Mussolini had sent 80,000 troops. Hitler had sent the Luftwaffe, which carried out Guerilla. The he never really. I mean, he always felt that was right. Later, the British government, the US government had much the same thing when they had an alliance with the Soviet Union. But he had felt that from quite early on in the 30s. He also, his feeling was that in Germany and later in Britain, that people said, why aren't you more moderate? And he said, the problem is the moderates never do anything apart from telling him to be more moderate. And he felt that right through. So he was, he felt that the effective opposition to appeasement of Germany, effective opposition to the government in Britain, what you required was to be organized by people who are pretty fanatical, but then you immediately had to get a very broad band of public opinion, which would include people who are very conservative in many ways, to stand with you, and then you could be quite effective. So he had quite well-worked theories of how you could oppose the powers that be, the authorities, and have an impact.
Was the week effective, do you think?
I think it was, yeah. I was sort of surprised by this. That's why the sort of subtitle of the book is The Invention of Guerrilla Journalism. He had a very sort of well-worked, he didn't have any money, as I said, or resources, but he thought that if, particularly when there was a great vacuum of information about things that people were really interested in and felt they weren't finding out about, that if you could have a publication which would sort of provide stories, influence the influencers, would reach politicians, above all would reach other journalists, you could have a big impact. I used to wonder about this, but actually looking at what MI5, British security and British politicians and senior sort of officials were saying, I think he was dead right. He didn't get much credit for this. And I think that was always inevitable because news outlets never want to admit they haven't been reporting. They generally, if they can get away with it, in my experience, do not want to say, well, actually, this story has been appearing before in this publication.
How come he was never shut down or censored or sued?
Well, his idea was that he had so little money, he had little office in Westminster, in Great Victoria Street, up a sort of shaky lift and a sort of stairs like a ladder. When people got to see him who might be wanting to sue him, they'd realize there was absolutely no chance of getting any money out of him. He also made clear he'd never apologize. So they knew they'd be in for a very tough fight. He said he'd always, if they had additional information which might show a different light on the story he'd printed, he'd happily do that. But of course, people just wanted him to withdraw some story, which was probably most often true. I mean, that hasn't changed much. And, there are letters from people who are thinking of suing the Week, who would then just realize that they'd have a terrible fight and they wouldn't get a penny out of him. So he thought hang tough, and it worked pretty well.
Hi, lovely listeners. Laura Flanders and Friends is, as we say, the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. Our guests are doing it. Now we just want to thank you, our member supporters, for doing your part. All of you who have yet to become members, please do it. Join our community today by making a one-time donation or make it monthly at lauraflanders.org/donate. That's lauraflanders.org/donate. Thank you. So let's come to the present. We have often on this program discussions with people that call themselves movement journalists. We talk about people doing journalism, covering social movements, focusing on social movements, accountable to social movements, and they tend to agree that they have a very different attitude towards this idea of objectivity than people that work for the commercial mainstream. How do you think about objectivity in light of your own reporting and the work of Claude? And how do you, what do you consider to be your role in the work that you do?
Well, obviously, I try to be objective, but I also, accept, and I think people get this a bit wrong, that, all news reporting is partisan for various reasons. First of all, you have newspapers boasting across the top of their editorial, the facts and only the facts. But since there are an infinite number of facts in the world, and we use our best judgment, or our bias, some would say, to select those facts, of course, our judgment comes into it. It's not as though there were 5 facts in the world, we found them. Claude, you described it, as being like sort of, say, we aren't like sort of gold miners and we find 5 nuggets and put them in. There are infinite number of gold nuggets, so to speak. So judgment always comes into it. And there are other things to do with the news business, I think, that, there's partisan ownership that creates great bias. But it's not, I think, people often think it's in fake facts. In my experience, it's normally selectivity. It's sometimes fake facts, and sometimes these are manufactured, particularly in wartime. There's also just selectivity, that various sort of parts of the news, aspects of the news, just don't get reported at all. They disappear. And also there's something that, often what's really going on is pretty complex, and people want to, they have a newspaper article, particularly on television and on screens, that they produce a sort of simplified version of events, which is so oversimplified and selective that it's totally misleading. So it's not a minor thing. It's not a minor thing. When I think of sort of wars I've covered, beginning in Northern Ireland in the 70s, over to, the wars in the Middle East, recent wars, the US invasion of Iraq, I mentioned Afghanistan, Libya. The main line of what the media was saying was untrue. It wasn't just wrong at the periphery. It had just completely misunderstood the situation. And I think that one of the problems is that people who are very absorbed, and particularly if they feel a deep sense of outrage about something what is happening, may not be very good at conveying it to a wider audience. Why not? Because, simply people who feel a sense of outrage feel that the truth sort of is shouting out from the front page. It isn't. You have to sort of present it to people. This was Claude, a point that Claude often made. You really had to think about how you presented this in order to get people's attention, even at things that you thought were of vast importance. And he used to cite the example, only actually his chief correspondent in Washington made to him early on when he was in the US. This was around about just after the Great Crash. And he said, when you're writing an article, imagine that you're writing for an old lady who's got a cat which she dearly loves. And all the time you're competing for her attention with that much loved cat. Now, it may sound frivolous, but actually it's a jolly good idea to think about that when you're trying to persuade people who may not be that interested or even hold contrary opinions, that what you say is true and worth listening to.
What do you think is the most important thing that mainstream journalists are getting wrong right now with respect to the Middle East?
I think they don't realize that, that whole peoples are involved in this. By this, I mean they talk about Hamas and Gaza, but one's really talking about, the Palestinians, what's happening to the Palestinians as a whole. Will the Israelis eliminate Hamas or Hezbollah? Yeah, but these sort of spring out of the Palestinian and the Shia Muslim community in Lebanon. These guys aren't going to go home, eliminate every last member of Hamas and Hezbollah. These problems will still be there. The violence will not stop. I think that when they talk about Iran, but the axis of resistance, but this is basically just the Shia community. What gives this substance is not sort of weapons from Iran, but this is the Shia communities in the Middle East. And so I think that's misunderstood. It was misunderstood in Iraq. It was misunderstood in Afghanistan. That when you were attacking, you could focus on leaders. You could kill the leaders. You could inflict great casualties on various movements. But underneath these were whole communities, millions of people who weren't going to be intimidated and were going to fight on. I think that that's something that isn't generally understood.
Do you think that a two-state solution is viable, ever was viable, is viable now?
Well, no, because, everybody's being, it's not only they don't have a state, they often don't have a village or they don't have a house to live on. I think it seems to me absurd and almost insulting to say in a sort of highfalutin way, could there be a two-state when somebody's just had their house bombed from underneath them? First of all, you want to have your house. Then you want to, maybe down the road, you also want to have a state. But if somebody's going to deny you that house, and if your village, you're going to be driven from your village or ordered out of your village within 45 minutes, you're not going to get they're not going to be willing to give you a state. So I think it's a diversion from reality, diversion from the terrible cruelty of what's going on to millions of, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, to go on about the two-state solution. I'm amazed that anybody's, basically diplomats in private accept this has been, as dead as anything for 20 years and still is.
It was never all that viable, I don't think. A diversion from what? Where should we be focusing at this moment? And if Claude was around today, where do you think he'd be focusing?
I think he'd be focusing on that. He'd been focusing on what's actually happening in the front line, on the ground, as opposed to what people say. I think there's rather more. I mean, one shouldn't be sort of too pessimistic about this. Simple things like the phone cameras mean that massacres which could have been covered up and were covered up or played down when I was first a journalist in Lebanon in the late 70s and 80s. I was actually in Sabra Shatila. There was a little bit of film of that. That was the massacre of the Palestinians there by the Christian militias backed by Israel. But there wasn't much. Now a lot of this stuff is impossible to hide. What's horrific is, although it's out there, it's not being hid. You still find these political leaders and other leaders saying somehow it's not happening, or it's not that bad, or it's somehow this should sort of go on. I think that's what's sort of truly horrific about present events. The good thing is that it's can no longer be hidden in a way it was in the past, or partly concealed. The horrible thing is that although it's out in the open, it's still happening, and not just Biden and Trump, but all these Starmer, all these European politicians, all behave as if it wasn't, and certainly don't do anything to stop it. I think that's what's. But I don't think one should be. I think one needs to just keep going at this. The point that Claude used to make continually, that those in authority, the powers that be, always want to say to everybody, you know, your efforts are so puny, you are so weak, we are so powerful, that it has absolutely no effect what you say. Now, Claude was wholly cynical about the motives of those with power and money, but he also thought they were much weaker than they looked, that they were always trying to defuse opposition by pretending it had no impact on them. It does, it has an enormous impact on them. And that, as I said earlier, one of the things that impressed me about Claude, that various historians that didn't make much impact, but when you actually got to the government's archives, you found it had enormous impact. I think that's still true. I think there's this continual bid from various directions that say that opposition, that protests have no impact on the course of events, and they do. And that furthermore, individuals, if they really think about it, can put up effective opposition. In other words, in sort of, if David fighting Goliath can, really think through his tactics or her tactics, then you can have an impact. That's what Claude believed toward the end of his life, and I think he was right.
The poet Audre Lorde used to say that the idea that you can't fight City Hall is a lie spread by City Hall.
Exactly.
I mentioned at the top that you had brothers. You have two, Andrew and Alexander. Alexander, much missed, passed away a few years ago. His publication, Counterpunch, surely is an example of the kind of guerrilla journalism that you describe. Are there other examples? I mean, we're an independent media outlet for sure. There are others out there. But how do you describe today, the impact today of this kind of independent, what you call guerrilla journalism?
Well, in Britain, you have Private Eye, which Claude also worked on when he was older, which doesn't have an exact US equivalent. People have tried to set up the equivalent in the US. And this is a fortnightly magazine, which is a mixture of sort of news and satire. And which very much does the same as The Week. I mean, when I look at it, I find, that it's had stories. I don't know how far they are known about in the US, but there was a tremendous scandal here about sub-postmasters being innocent sub-postmasters, about 900 of them being accused of stealing money, put in jail, their lives ruined. Turned out it was all they're completely innocent and so forth. Private Eye had been going on about this for about 10 years till the rest of the media caught on. They never mentioned this, very practically never, that Private Eye had been doing this longer than 10 years, actually. The Mohammed Al-Fayed has that, the man who owned Harrods, the great department store, who has been exposed as a horrible sexual predator and rapist, and who was sort of preyed on his own staff. Suddenly this is being exposed, partly because he's dead. But Private Eye was publishing this in 1998, more than a quarter of a century ago. It never got picked up.
So maybe it's just a matter of time. I mean, I have to say, I look at the situation that we're in today and think about the impact of The Week in a period that probably at that time also felt like fairly locked down in terms of the conventional narrative of what was going on. Claude was up against, with a very small machine, up against very big megaphone for the government and its point of view. Today feels somewhat similar, although there are, as you point out, two ways to look at it. On the one hand, sort of explosion of independent media, and you talked about the guerrilla journalism of proud Palestinian reporters who are the only people getting the word out about what is happening on the ground, despite the brutal assault that they've been under and the many casualties they've taken. In the US, too, you see a lot of independent media outlets, ours being one of them, but at the same time, a concentration of media power in a few hands, like Elon Musk's, that sometimes look to me to have the kind of power of a Goebbels of today. distributing a free platform that is a funnel for a certain point of view, and taking no responsibility for the results of that often hate-mongering and lies that spread. Which way do you look at it? Are we in a better moment, a less good moment, or is it just the same old moment and we trundle forward?
Well, it's a pretty bad moment, and it also is sort of bad because, one likes to feel things are getting better in the world, there's a degree of progress, that the sort of savagery, of the past won't be revisited in similar form today. But it turns out that maybe it is. Maybe human beings don't progress very much. In some ways, it was worse then, I think, because now there are alternative means of communication to a wide audience. I mean, like what you and I are doing, but elsewhere, and it requires people to pick it up. But there are alternatives. Claude used a mimeograph machine to put out his stuff, and he said, "Look, this is a sort of a small weapon, a bit like a sort of handgun, up against the sort of tanks and armored cars of the big battalions of the media, but still you can use it and still it can be effective." Now, these days, there are many more handguns around if that's the right analogy, on the internet, elsewhere. So you can have an impact, but it's not game over. The main organs of the mass media, still, they don't have quite the total dominance they do, but it's an overriding dominance. So I think that the balance is less skewed against people who want to, basically, say, stop doing the terrible things you're doing and expose those.
But going back to the beginning, you said Claude was able to have impact because he was one of a few voices. Today, there are many voices countering the traditional, the conventional, the pro-status quo kind of version of life. And it seems that even when good things are published, I'm thinking of a very good investigation in a mainstream publication, the New York Times Magazine, looking into the violence of the settler movement and its collection to the contemporary administration of Bibi Netanyahu, seemed to have no impact, although it was you would have thought, an extraordinary expose of people who should absolutely not be in power and not receive U.S. weapons, and are now in the very top of that government.
I think
so that concerns me.
Yeah, this is true. There aren't also sort of political movements putting this out. It's sort of, every so often I see articles like that. Maybe they're in the New York Times, maybe that suddenly reveal something and prove something, like somebody did a very good survey of the U.S. bombing in Iraq around Mosul about 7 or 8 years ago, going to the villages where the U.S. Air Force said they'd killed one person. You may remember this. It turned out the real figure was 40. Half of them were sort of women, children, and so forth. Complete lies, which they've been saying. Now, I think that often those who oppose this don't, should be circulating this the whole time. They should take this article, another article like the one you just mentioned, and make sure everybody gets it. Unfortunately, they often think the horrid old New York Times, God, I'm not going to circulate anything from them or from elsewhere. I think people don't necessarily think through, when established media institutions produce something like that. Another one, I remember CNN about, the attack on an aid convoy in Gaza. They've done a lot of work on this. Again, I feel somebody should have been distributing this. One of the problems is, which has probably grown worse, which is there's now such an ocean of information on the internet that things get swallowed up, even things that appear in mainline publications, which you think would, people would see this and react to this, but it gets swallowed up in a great sort of in this vast sort of ocean of information that is out there, unless somebody sort of drags it to the surface and keeps pointing at it.
Talking about that ocean, your other brother Andrew has been doing extraordinary reporting on the role of Amazon in this moment, in providing IT services and satellite services to the Israeli Defense Force, so-called. Another important story, you can find that at Harper's. The family continues to do this work. I'd love to ask you the question, Patrick, that I ask all of our guests, which is what you think the story will be that future journalists will tell of now. Look forward 50, 90 years. What will the reporters be saying about this period, do you think?
I think that how did we return to an era of wars, which is similar to the 20s and above all to the 1930s. I think we are back in a devil's decade. I think they'll be pretty astonished, particularly Gaza and Lebanon and Iran. I covered many previous wars in the Middle East. Usually the US may have been complicit with Israel in various attacks and invasions, but after a bit, they would restrain them. That hasn't happened this time. This is pretty extraordinary. We go into why that hasn't happened. So there's a much more accidental feel about this. Some things that have happened, let's say in Ukraine, there's a feeling of inevitability about some of those things. Maybe it could have been avoided, but there were sort of major forces moving towards a confrontation. Certainly, the tinder was dry in the Middle East. I've been writing for quite some time. It sometimes was going to blaze up. But I must say, the actual circumstances of Gaza, the role of the Biden administration was something I didn't expect. So it happened quicker. It happened when it didn't have to happen. And it'd been an awful lot worse than I imagined. So likewise in the 1930s, there was inevitability of what was going to happen after Hitler came to power, after Franco had won the civil war in Spain, or was winning, the rise of fascism, very difficult to stop. And in one sense, Claude did get exactly what he wanted at the end of the day, which he'd, rather to his own amazement, which was he'd wanted a British government, and indeed a US government, fully committed to fighting fascism and the Nazis and Hitler. Eventually that happened. He said they could only do this in alliance with the Soviet Union. That happened too. 2/3 of the German army was on the Eastern Front come D-Day. And in Britain, you had a sort of Popular Front government that sort of united everybody. So in a way, he was sort of come the war, the Second World War. Most of the things he'd wanted had happened. Had he played any role in this? Well, the people who wanted that to happen eventually won out, both on the right and the left. So I don't think one should sort of depress oneself too much. Those in power, I think, are more vulnerable. I think one can have more impact than one thinks. Or, Claude, it's often said, that I think horrible phrase, talking truth to power. Well, dear old power certainly doesn't want to hear the truth. It's a very good idea, the truth doesn't want to lose its power. What you ought to do, what everybody ought to do, is tell the truth to the powerless and enable them to do something about it, or at least know what's happening so they can act. That's what he was sort of about. And that's what I think others should be about too.
Do you fear Donald Trump? Do you fear Donald Trump? Trumpism?
I fear Trumpism. I'm fairly frightened of Biden too. I mean, there is a continuity in the US government, if I may say so, in their policies, whether whoever's there. people say different things, but when you look at Iraq, Afghanistan and Iraq, but hold on a minute. Obama is in power and we have Libya. What's happened to Libya now? The whole place is destroyed. Then we move on to Trump, who actually started known wars. I read a book called Wars in the Age of Trump, but they were all wars that were started before Trump. Maybe this was an accident. Major wars start under Biden. Maybe this would have happened anyway, but there is a sort of continuity in this. And I think also reading Claude's stuff, in some ways he looked at the background of a typical Englishman. He went to public school, he went to Oxford. Because he was brought up in Central Europe in the midst of wars, he had a very clear idea what wars were like. I get the impression that sort of politicians, Biden and all these others, those who push these wars, don't really know what they're like. I don't mean in terms of horror. They don't understand how, they're full of wild cards. You can't. Whoever thinks people who start wars think they control them. They can't. They spin out of control almost immediately. I think Claude understood that very well, but he had a background which was much more like that of a Central European, very similar. Many of his sort of political friends were anti-Nazi Germans, many of them Jewish, but part of German culture. So he had a very tough, but I think ultimately all too realistic view of the way things worked.
Patrick Cockburn, thank you so much for joining us. We will put all the information about the rest of your books and this new one, Believe Nothing Till It's Officially Denied, out now from Verso at our website.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more information on this episode, check out our show notes posted for free at patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Please join our members now by making a one-time donation or make it monthly. All the details are at lauraflanders.org. Again, that's lauraflanders.org. And thanks to all of our member supporters.